Okay. So, something just shifted in this investigation. And I do not mean shifted in a small way. I mean shifted in a way that changes how we understand who is actually running this case. Who is actually in control and what the relationship between the Guthrie family and the Pima County Sheriff's Office actually looks like right now. Because this week, Sheriff Chris Nanos sat down with People magazine and he said some things. Some things that were new, some things that raised more questions than they answered. And one thing in particular that I think changes the entire picture of where this investigation stands on day 104. Journalist Brian Enton, who has been covering this case since the very first day and who has become one of the most reliable voices on the ground, went through that interview carefully and then brought in Morgan Wright, a former investigator and law enforcement expert with over 40 years of experience to break down what it all means. So let us go through it carefully one piece at a time, because when you put it all together the picture that forms is one that I do not think enough people are fully processing yet. Okay. So let us start with the biggest one, because this is the detail that stopped Brian Anton in his tracks, and honestly when you hear it should stop you too. Sheriff Chris Nanos told People magazine that he is no longer directly communicating with the Guthrie family. He said those conversations are now being handled by the FBI. Let me say that again. Slowly, the sheriff of Pima County, the man who is technically still in charge of this investigation, whose department has never officially handed the case over to the FBI, is no longer talking directly to the family of the missing person at the center of that investigation. The FBI is. Now, let me stop right there because I need you to understand what that actually means in a law enforcement context. And Morgan Wright, with over 40 years of experience, was direct about it. He said in his entire career, it is unusual for the originating agency to not be in communication with the victim's family. The originating agency, the agency that has investigative authority. That is the sheriff's office, and they are not talking to the Guthrie. Think about that, right? You are the sheriff. You are the one who stood at those press conferences. You are the one who told the world your team is going to solve this. You are the one who is technically still in charge. And now the family of the missing woman is only talking to the FBI. What does that tell you? Morgan Wright said it could mean one of two things. Either something significant is happening behind the scenes, something in an advanced stage, something that falls clearly within the FBI's lane, like a hostage negotiation or an advanced intelligence operation or a forensic development that requires federal handling. Or it means the relationship between the sheriff and the Guthrie family has broken down to the point where the FBI has essentially stepped in to manage it. And honestly, both of those things might be true simultaneously. Now, Brian Anon has been careful throughout his reporting, respectful of what the family is going through, but he said directly he has wondered for a while the family actually thinks of the sheriff. Given all the reporting, given all the mistakes that have been documented, given all the controversy around Nanos and the Board of Supervisors, they must know they are not isolated from the coverage. And the fact that the sheriff himself is now saying they are not talking to me anymore answers a question that has been sitting in the background of this investigation for months. The Guthrie family is not happy with Chris Nanos, and they have found a different line of communication. Now Morgan Wright made a point that I think is worth sitting with. He said when you are working a major case you always want to maintain contact with the family. Always, because at some point you're going to need them when a case gets built, when it goes to trial. You need their cooperation. You need their testimony. You need them on your side. And if you have spent over 100 days in a situation where the family's trust has eroded to the point where they only talk to the FBI, you have created a problem for yourself that goes beyond the investigation itself. And then Nano said something else, something that I think is one of the most direct acknowledgements he has made publicly since this began. He said the public is frustrated. Even the Guthrie family. He said that out loud to a national magazine. He acknowledged that the family is frustrated. Now look, how could they not be, right? 104 days, no arrest, no named suspect, no confirmed proof of life. Their mother, their grandmother has been gone for over 3 months, and the sheriff is still saying, "We are getting closer. We believe in the process." But the fact that he is now publicly acknowledging the family's frustration while also confirming he is not even talking to them directly anymore tells you something about the state of this relationship that no press conference has ever said out loud before. The sheriff is technically in charge. The FBI is actually running things, and the Guthrie family knows it. Okay, now let me move to the DNA, because Nano said something about the DNA this week that is simultaneously optimistic and alarming, and Morgan Wright broke it down in a way that I think gives us the clearest picture yet of where the forensic investigation actually stands. So here is what Nano said, direct quote. He said, "I know we have DNA that is unknown who the contributor or depositor is, but I think they are getting closer to finding out who that was. I have confidence in our labs. When the labs tell us, hey, there is nothing else we can do, well, then maybe we have got a problem. We have got a cold case. But right now, the labs are not telling us that. Okay? So, let me break that down piece by piece because each part matters. First, the optimistic part. He said they are getting closer to finding out who the DNA contributor is. That is new. That is specific. That is the first time we have heard him say getting closer in the context of the DNA identification rather than just the investigation overall. And if you understand how investigative genetic genealogy works, that phrasing suggests something specific. Morgan Wright explained it clearly. He said, when the sheriff says getting closer, the analysis is probably already done. What they are likely doing now is the genealogy work. Building family trees from partial DNA matches, working outward from second and third cousin connections in public databases, narrowing the candidates. That process, according to Wright, takes anywhere from 60 to 90 days just to get a good feel for the landscape. Who is out there? Who is connected to who? And here is the thing about that timeline. The hair sample was sent to Quantico and Estra Forensics in mid-April. 60 to 90 days from mid-April puts you at mid-June to mid-July. So we may be approaching the window where that work starts to produce results. But and now here is the alarming part. Nanos also said, if the labs tell us there is nothing else they can do, then maybe we have a cold case. Cold case. He said those words out loud for the first time publicly. Brian Anton noted that. He said his sources close to the investigation have been telling him exactly that they are waiting on the DNA, and if it does not produce something, there is not much else to go on right now. No solid suspect, no dominant lead, essentially waiting on the lab. And Morgan Wright added critical context here that I think everyone needs to hear. He said, DNA does not come with a date and timestamp. You do not know when that hair was deposited or under what circumstances. The fact that the crime scene was uncontrolled for a period in those first chaotic days. Remember what Sergeant Aaron Cross called the first week. Chaotic means there is a real possibility that the DNA found inside NY's home was introduced not by the perpetrator, but by someone who had legitimate access to the property in the days surrounding the disappearance. Now, that is a sobering thing to hear because it means that even if the genetic genealogy work produces a name, that name still has to be placed in context, still has to be corroborated by other evidence, still has to survive the challenge that any competent defense attorney would immediately raise. Morgan Wright also talked about the gloves found 2 miles from NY's home. He said those gloves turned out to be, in his words, a nothing burger because they were never definitively tied to the crime scene. And DNA on a surface you were never confirmed to have been near means nothing without that connection. So where does that leave us? The DNA is the best lead they have. The sheriff believes they are getting closer. The genetic genealogy work is ongoing. C.C. Moore and Estria Forensics are involved. The science is real and it has worked in other cases. But the cold case warning coming from the sheriff himself tells you exactly how much is riding on that lab. Everything. Okay. So now I want to spend real time on something that Morgan Wright said this week because it is one of the most genuinely new analytical frameworks that has been applied to this case. And once you hear it, you will never look at that doorbell footage the same way again. So for over 100 days, the debate around the figure at NY's door has focused on one question. Was he trying to hide his face or was he performing for some other reason? Morgan Wright has a different theory entirely, and it is not based on speculation. He was very clear about that. It is based on training, on experience, on the National Crime Victimization Survey, on real case data. He said the guy at the door was not worried about being identified. Wait, Wright, let me stop there. He was not worried about being seen. Think about what that means. He stood out there. He had a flashlight in his mouth. He was stuffing vegetation in front of the lens. He was standing there long enough that had the camera been recording to the cloud, everything he did would have been captured completely. He was not worried about his face. He was wearing a mask. He was not worried about his body. He was covered head to toe. What he was worried about, Morgan Wright concluded, was the vehicle. Here is the logic, and it is compelling. A vehicle is trackable in a way that a masked face is not. A vehicle has a make, a model, a year, a color, a partial license plate, a distinctive feature that a camera might capture and that law enforcement could use to identify it through DMV records, through intelligence files, through the kind of reverse lookup that Morgan Wright described from his own career. He talked about a fatality accident. He worked as a state trooper where all they had was a small piece of the grille and from that one piece the year, the make, the model, a partial VIN number, they tracked down the vehicle, one small piece of physical evidence, and they found the car. Now apply that to this case. If the doorbell camera had been actively recording and transmitting to the cloud when the vehicle pulled up, the one that NY's blood stops at the curb right next to the one that she was loaded into, investigators would have had that footage within hours, and they would have had a vehicle to trace. So the guy at the door was not covering the camera to hide himself. He was covering the camera to hide the car because he knew the car was the most identifiable and most traceable element of the entire operation. That changes everything because it tells you this person, whoever they are, understood how vehicle identification works in law enforcement. Understood that a masked face in surveillance footage is a problem, but a vehicle on that same footage is a catastrophic problem. The kind that gets you tracked to your home address through a DMV database within 24 hours. That is not someone who stumbled into this. That is someone who thought through the investigative process and planned around it. Morgan Wright also made a point about the blood. He said, "Look where the blood goes. Look where it stops. It stops at the exact place where a vehicle would have to have been positioned for Nancy to be loaded in." That is not circumstantial. That is physics. That is the physical record of what happened at that curb in the early morning hours of February 1st. She was put in a car right there where the blood stops, and that car drove away. And whoever was driving it knew before they ever arrived at that house that they needed to make sure no camera caught the car leaving. Okay, now let me get into the thousands of videos, because this is something Sheriff Nanos addressed directly in his People magazine interview, and Morgan Wright's response to it is one of the most practically useful things said about this investigation in weeks. So Nanos said there are thousands and thousands of videos out there from intersections and ring cameras that we have to catalog. Maybe it is all the white trucks over here, all the red sedans over there. You have got to have it. So when you do find a suspect John Doe, we can go back and say, what else do we know about John Doe? Okay, so on the surface that makes sense, right? You catalog everything. And when you have a name, you cross-reference. But Morgan Wright said that approach is inverted. And I think the way he explained it is genuinely illuminating. So, let me walk through it carefully. He said, you already know something crucial. You know the approximate window when Nancy was taken. The pacemaker sync stopped at 2:28 in the morning. So, you know, she was in a vehicle no later than that. Probably moving somewhere between 2:12 and 2:28 based on the accelerometer data. That is your window. Now, instead of cataloging every vehicle and waiting for a suspect name to cross-reference against, flip it. Take that 212 to 228 window. Pull every vehicle that was in motion within a reasonable radius of NY's home during that window. That is your universe. And it is a much smaller universe than every vehicle ever captured on every camera. He called it egress analysis. You look at the ways out, the road south toward Interstate 19, the route toward Nollas, the corridor heading toward the border. You look at what vehicles were moving through those corridors in that specific time window. And you start eliminating not that car wrong direction, not that car wrong size, not that car wrong timeline. And you keep eliminating until you have a manageable subset of vehicles of genuine interest. And then, and this is the part that made me sit up, he said, if any of those vehicles also appear at a border crossing within a plausible time frame, that connection becomes significant. Because if you drove from NY's house to the Nollas crossing, that takes time. You could not make that crossing in 15 minutes. Physically impossible. But an hour and a half to 2 hours later, plausible. Especially with a cooling off period somewhere along the way. So you cross-reference the vehicles in your egress window against vehicles that cross the border in the appropriate time frame, and you look for overlap. That is not speculation. That is logistics. That is physics. And it is the kind of analysis that narrows a search from thousands of videos down to a handful of real candidates. Morgan Wright said he actually did this analysis. He put together an egress map showing the ways out of the Catalina foothills area and the time constraints on each route. And he said, the approach Nanos described, cataloging everything and waiting for a suspect name to match against, is less efficient than starting with a time window and working backward. Now, does that mean Nanos' team is not doing this? Not necessarily. It is entirely possible they are doing both approaches simultaneously. But what Morgan Wright's analysis tells you is that the vehicle, the one that was so important to conceal that the figure at the door spent time making sure the camera could not see it, may already be traceable through the right combination of timestamp analysis, egress mapping, and border crossing records. The question is whether that work has been done and whether it has produced something that investigators are not yet ready to share publicly. Okay, so Brian Anton asked Morgan Wright the question that has been sitting at the center of this investigation since day one. Was this a burglary gone wrong, or was this a targeted abduction? And Morgan Wright's answer was about as definitive as I have heard from anyone with his level of experience. He said there is very little, if anything, to indicate that it was a burglary gone wrong. Let me explain why he said that. Because the reasoning matters. He said, a burglary and a kidnapping require completely different skill sets, completely different mindsets. A burglary is about theft. You go in, you take things, you leave. You do not want contact with anyone inside the property. Contact means complications. Contact means witnesses. Contact means things get messy. A kidnapping is about control. It requires planning for control from the moment of entry. It requires planning for the physical management of another person. It requires planning for transport, for containment, for what comes after you leave the house with a person who does not want to come with you. You cannot accidentally slide from burglary mode into kidnapping mode mid-operation. Those are not compatible mindsets. You do not walk into a house expecting to steal things and walk out with an 84-year-old woman as a hostage unless you came in specifically planning to do exactly that. And then Morgan Wright said something that I think is the most important framing of this case that has been said publicly in over 100 days. He said this is a nobody homicide. Not a missing person case, not a kidnapping for ransom, a nobody homicide, which means he believes Nancy Guthrie is no longer alive, and that the investigation should be working from that premise. He listed the reasons: her age, her cardiac condition, the time of night she was taken, the blood, the fact that medication critical to her survival was left on the counter, the fact that the ransom notes went to media outlets rather than directly to the family, the fact that the Bitcoin wallet has never been touched. All of it in his assessment points not to someone being held somewhere waiting to be ransomed, but to a crime that was completed on the night of January 31st. Now, I want to be careful here because law enforcement has not publicly declared Nancy dead. The family has not declared Nancy dead. And there are people including Elizabeth Smart who lived through her own abduction who have said publicly that Nancy could absolutely still be alive. But Morgan Wright's assessment reflects what multiple law enforcement experts have said privately about this case for weeks. And the fact that he said it plainly, nobody homicide, that is what the evidence points to, is something that deserves to be acknowledged honestly, because if he is right, it changes the entire focus of the investigation from finding a living person to building a case for prosecution. And that shift, quiet as it may be why the FBI is now handling all family communications directly. Okay, so one more question. That Morgan Wright addressed directly, and it is the one that has divided experts since the beginning. One person or two. We have heard the two-person theory from multiple credible voices. The logistics of taking an 84-year-old woman against her will, transporting her, managing her, those require more than one person. The rear floodlights were smashed at the same time the front camera was being covered. Two simultaneous entry points, two roles, two people. But Morgan Wright raised something that I think genuinely challenges that, and it connects directly to why over 100 days in, nobody has come forward for $1,200,000. He said two people cannot keep a secret. A secret can only be kept by one person. Now think about that in the context of this reward. $1,200,000 sitting on the table unclaimed for over 100 days. If there are two people involved, one of them should have cracked by now. That is the math. That is what every expert has said. Maureen Unal said it. Steve Moore said it. The logic is consistent across every professional who has weighed in. Two people under this much pressure with this much money available cannot both hold their nerve indefinitely. And yet nobody has called. Nobody has claimed that reward. Morgan Wright said that silence is actually consistent with a single offender. A lone wolf. Someone who does not have a partner to worry about. Someone who is carrying this alone and who may be far enough away from this community that nobody around them has connected them to this case. He made a point about traveling criminals. He said if this person is not from the Tucson area, there is nothing in the local police files that references them. No prior contact, no intelligence reports, no field interview cards. They came in, committed this crime and left. And there is nothing organic in the system to pull them back into view. That is why despite the footage, despite the backpack identification, despite the height and build description, there is still no suspect. Not because investigators are not working, but because the person they are looking for may have no local footprint at all. Now, Morgan Wright was careful. He said both are possible. And he acknowledged the point Jim Clemente made about the blood pattern close to the ground consistent with someone being carried out, which could support either single strong person or two people sharing the weight. But the silence of that reward over 100 days, $1,200,000, nobody moved. That is the loudest argument for a single offender that exists in this case. And it is an argument made entirely by the absence of anything happening. Okay. Now, let me address the FBI tension directly because Nanos went out of his way in this People magazine interview to push back on everything Kash Patel said. He said coordination with the FBI began soon after learning of NY's disappearance. He said the FBI was with us day one. He said Director Patel has his right to his opinions, adding that he believes some remarks were factually inaccurate. He said the plane was started immediately. He said they found blood and search and rescue did exactly what they were supposed to do. Now, we have been through this contradiction before, but it is worth noting something new that emerged this week. Dr. Matthew Hines, one of the Puma County supervisors, said something in his recent public statements that Brian Enton flagged as something he had not heard discussed before. Hines said that beyond the investigative argument for letting the FBI handle the DNA, there was also a financial argument. He believes the Nancy Guthrie case has already cost Puma County approximately $1 million, and that if they had simply let the FBI take the DNA and manage the investigation from the beginning, the county would have saved enormous amounts of money. The FBI investigation would have been federally funded. Instead, the county has been carrying the financial burden of a case that has required resources far beyond what a standard sheriff's department handles. $1 million of county money on a case that the FBI director said his agency was ready to handle from night one with hundreds of agents with a fixed-wing aircraft with the most advanced forensic laboratory in the country, and the sheriff said no. Morgan Wright was measured in his assessment of the criticism toward Nanos. He said, "Not all of it is fair. Some people criticize without understanding how investigations actually work. DNA results do not come back in 44 minutes because that is how long a television drama runs. Mixed DNA, convoluted DNA is genuinely difficult to analyze in a way that holds up in court. There is real science behind the delays that the public does not always appreciate." But he also said the record speaks for itself on things like whether the FBI was called in. Director Patel has one story, the sheriff has another, and the record speaks for itself. And the record right now shows a Puma County Board of Supervisors that compelled the sheriff to give sworn testimony under oath. A bipartisan group of county supervisors calling for his resignation. A county that has spent $1 million on a case that the FBI was ready to take the lead on from night one. And a Guthrie family that is no longer speaking to the sheriff at all. That is the record, and it speaks for itself. Okay, so let me bring it all together. Day 104. Here is what we know from this week's developments. The sheriff is no longer talking to the Guthrie family. The FBI is handling all family communications. That tells you who is actually running this investigation regardless of what the official chain of command says on paper. The DNA is the central thread. Nanos said they are getting closer to identifying the contributor. Morgan Wright said that phrasing suggests genetic genealogy work is already underway. The 60 to 90-day timeline for that work puts us potentially within weeks of a development. But Nanos also said if the labs come back with nothing, we might have a cold case. That word cold case from the sheriff himself for the first time publicly. That is not reassuring. That is honest, and it tells you exactly how much rides on what C.C. Moore and Estrada forensics produce. The vehicle theory from Morgan Wright reframes the entire doorbell footage. That figure was not covering the camera to hide his face. He was covering it to hide the car because the car was the one piece of this operation that could be definitively identified and traced. That level of operational thinking, planning around vehicle identification, specifically suggests someone who either has experience in this or planned for it with unusual care. The thousands of videos are being catalogued, but Morgan Wright says they should be approaching it from the other direction. Start with the time window. Build an egress map. Cross-reference with border crossing records. Work backward from the physics of what is possible rather than forward from an eventual suspect identification. And the single offender theory, while not definitive, gains credibility from the silence of that reward. $1,200,000 over 100 days. Nobody has called. And if two people were involved, that silence is increasingly difficult to explain. Now, let me be honest about what we still do not know. We do not know where Nancy Guthrie is. We do not know if she is alive. We do not know what the DNA at Quantico has actually produced. We do not know what happened in those 4 days that Kash Patel says the FBI was excluded. We do not know what is on that sealed 911 call. And we do not know why, after the family has been publicly cleared, the investigation still appears to orbit around the people closest to Nancy in the hours before she disappeared. These are not small gaps. These are the central questions. But here is what I will say. The FBI is now the primary point of contact for the Guthrie family. That is not nothing. That is not a procedural detail. When the family of a missing person stops talking to the local agency and only talks to the federal agency, that tells you something about who has the information, who has the leads, and who the family trusts to bring this to a resolution. The FBI has the DNA at Quantico. The FBI has the resources. The FBI has the genetic genealogy expertise. And the FBI has the family's trust. Nanos can talk to People magazine all he wants, but the family has already voted with their silence toward him. Savannah Guthrie posted on Mother's Day, 100 days in, and wrote words that I cannot read without feeling the weight of them. Mother, daughter, sister, Nan, we miss you with every breath. We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you. 104 days now. And the pacemaker inside Nancy Guthrie's chest is still running, still logging, still keeping count of every moment she has been gone. The whole truth of what happened to her every second since 2:28 on the morning of February 1st is stored inside a device the size of a small matchbox implanted in the chest of a woman who deserves to come home. The FBI is running this now. The DNA is at Quantico. C.C. Moore does not fail quietly. And the silence of that reward, $1,200,000 unclaimed for 104 days, is either the loudest argument for a single offender in this entire case, or it is one more thing that is about to change. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, call 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can be completely anonymous. The reward is real. The investigation is active and Nancy is still out there. Stay with us.